Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Oladejo. Let's start off the conversation with the CIT numbers. I'm not surprised here, but for people looking outside in, they will be questioning, does this mean we're seeing weakening corporate profitability? Does it align to grow tax avoidance, or just the overall, should I say, disruptive nature of the new tax regime we have at this point in time? Very interesting questions for those who are looking outside in, but these numbers are no surprise. Walk me through your take.
Thanks for having me, David. I think, like you mentioned, those that have been following, the developments will not quite be surprising, because when you look at what has happened in the corporate side, and then you look at the fact that it's the converse that has happened with transaction, which is VAT, then you would get to understand where that probably is coming from. So that quarter-on-quarter review or the analysis definitely shows impact of the level of compliance. It shows timing difference. It shows the impact of the tax laws, that have just recently been reformed. But like you said, is this something to worry about? If you ask me, I would say no, because we need to see the total picture yet. When we have all the companies that would have filed their returns and made payments, for the period, then we would be able to say precisely what we are dealing with. Quite frankly, in terms of the reforms, the rates did not change, for corporate, income. What might have also impacted one or two things would be some of the incentives, which ordinarily should impact, government revenue, but the full weight of that is what one would have to wait for, when the entire year.
I understand. We all have to wait and see before we can then do a proper assessment of the numbers movement. But let's talk about the foreign and then domestic contribution at this point in time. Now, when you look at that data, what does this reveal about the health and overall tax-paying capacity of our indigenous firms?
Okay, because we are just coming out of a reform, right? The impact that the reform would have, it's expected to be significant. The reform of this nature, Nigeria hasn't quite, had something like this in recent times. So it is expected that there would be some shiftings and shakings and all of that. Then when you also look at what has happened in terms of how the reform has specifically focused on certain fundamentals, like ensuring that the spectrum for VAT, for instance, is widened for input VAT. So it's more like saying, we know that revenue has been consistent through these lines over the years, but we want to shift the focus, such that we can allow more participation, So maybe we would initially see a dip in the indigenous, contribution. And then once you have more participation within the net over the period, you recall that a lot of companies have also been granted exemptions, if you have less than 100 million. So all of those things would play out. We would see how it will. But the question is, those companies will not remain at that level of revenue for the period. When you file returns, government already has your data. Then when you start becoming profitable or you have higher revenue threshold, then you would have to start contributing to the pot. So in terms of
the money.
Exactly. So in terms of indigenous participation, there would be, it is expected that there should be more and more trust from the part of the citizens to say, okay, if no one is asking me to pay anything now, then you should make me want to comply.
Okay. And talking about trust and compliance at this point, let's bring into focus now Rev 360 tax enforcement and compliance as a whole. Would you say this would be Nigeria's equivalent of a 360 surveillance system? And then when we also talk about that, because at the end of the day, data is also quite a interesting topic here. Privacy, data protection concerns that might emerge. So for you, the full picture of how this Rev 360 might transform further our landscape and then concerns around data protection.
Okay, so because the service isn't new in this space, you recall that we've had e-tax, we've had Tax Pro Max that we've had. So Rev 360 is an improved platform.
On steroids.
Exactly. is an improved platform, haven't learned from all of the shortcomings of those previous platforms that we've had. And quite frankly, the level of seamlessness that it brings into tax administration is laudable, quite frankly. And it is expected that it also increases the way citizens interface, with government. Because when you take away some of the bottlenecks that people used to experience, in wanting to comply, what you have done is you have reduced the hurdle that taxpayers would think of wanting to cross for compliance. So Rev 360 is an improved platform. It's more seamless than what we had before. They've also deployed these in a bid to ensure that some of the provisions that you have relying on technology in the new tax law are strengthened. You don't want to have a law that you do not have the mechanism to execute. And I think that's a very good handshake there that the Nigeria Revenue Service has.
But how much of additional revenue do you think this will pull in?
Well, time will tell, because compliance, you mentioned the issue of trust. Improved trust would automatically lead to improved level of compliance. So if I know that the chances of system glitch, the chances are now remote, if I know that my data is secure, which are the things that have been promised now, if I know that no one is going to come after me for something that I've not done, or there's not going to be a situation where someone else's data is being used to profile me, then that should ordinarily aid improved compliance, and that should also translate into numbers.
But let's also talk about the sugar debate, because last week that was one of the biggest news headlines we also had, and it's still the question around whether or not we're going to see government press forward with that. But the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria is speaking about a 2.8 trillion naira loss within the first 6 to 12 month timeline if the government goes on with this. LCCI has said the government needs to recalibrate, and then even when you're pushing the health financing picture, which is good, you have to achieve the right balance here. But how credible would you say is this number, 2.8 trillion naira loss? How credible, or what sort of assumptions possibly could underpin that?
The amount, it's a potential loss, and I'm sure that the numbers must have been worked out from probable addition that will be paid, which will be overall increased cost to manufacturers. Now, one thing to note with this agenda is, in most sophisticated parts of the world, right, tax usually is a tool that sometimes government uses not just for revenue generation, but to also exert some form of control on citizens' choices. And this sugar tax, for instance, is one of such examples. In climes where this has really worked well, once you see the raise on that particular commodity, you will see a sharp decline. There will be consistent, monitoring. It's not going to be something that you implement this on its own. It's going on a free-flowing motion, and then you're not watching this. No, you're going to take statistics of the number of patients that were diabetic in year 1. After this is raised, you're going to take the same statistics. So the question is, as a nation, do we have all of those data? Do we have sufficient information to be able to justify the impact of what will be done? That is on the one side. On the other side is, remember we talked about the trust issue. Even though the government has said in the bill that a portion of the money that is going to be raised through this, the increased revenue is going to be earmarked, for improved healthcare sector. We've had promises, time and time and again that has not been fulfilled. So some citizens may also think, oh, this is just going to be another promise. But if the government continues to demonstrate that we really mean this, because you are moving from a defined amount of 10 naira per litre to a percentage on retail. That can be very, very dicey. Exactly, and very injurious to production.
We are really pressed for time, but we'll leave the conversation here for now.